I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Rob, what are we looking at today?
We're back to an old favorite, which was Tao Yuanming, the great Six Dynasties poet.
We looked at him before with what?
Well, he's most famous even now for his prose treatment of the Peach Blossom Mountain, Peach Blossom Grove, which even now that's sort of the standard Chinese term for utopia. We have a podcast on that one already. We talked about the fact that it's really kind of a weird utopia.
Yeah, it's fun, but a little strange.
It's interesting though, because I think his notion of utopia there ties kind of neatly into the poem we're talking about today, because he is, at least in literary circles, best known for his poetry. He wrote at a time when poetry tended to be a little more flowery,
and he's responding to that.
This is the way I think of him. I think of him sort of like the Thoreau or the Emerson of this particular period.
Don't insult him like that.
You don't like Thoreau or Emerson?
I hate Thoreau.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I don't know why I thought you were like a huge fan or
No.
something. Really? Why don't you like Thoreau?
I just find him full of himself and just a bag of wind.
So Lee's very subtle in his opinions about Thoreau. What about Emerson?
I'm less familiar with Emerson. I've read some of him, but I don't have as much of an
I remember
opinion.
distinctly being made to read Thoreau and Emerson when I was in high school, and I thought it was garbage.
I read it in I read Thoreau in middle school, and I was
What
just
did you read of Thoreau in middle school?
Walden, obviously.
Really? They made you read that in middle school?
No, I read it on my own.
Oh,
Thank you
well, that's
very
the
much.
problem, because you're a nerd. That's the real problem here.
Because I have an opinion about literature.
So you're a nerd. That's the definition of a nerd. That's kind of a tangent. But Tao Yuanming does help to kind of popularize this return to nature writing. Like, I'm going to leave behind the evils of humanity and go live off in the country and do things like that.
I've seen some suggestions that he was influential for the beat poets of the 1950s and 60s.
Yeah.
I've not actually, I can't draw a line there.
That's
but
weird. I find that weird because I've read so many beats that they don't sound they sound nothing like Tao Yuanming.
So if you think about it, so Tao Yuanming is very concerned with ideas of kind of rejecting civil discourse. His biography, if we could sum it up, is essentially he left the bureaucracy, which at the time was, if you wanted to be anybody, if you wanted to be somebody, you had to be in the bureaucracy. And he was like, nope, not going to do that. Mic drop. I mean, obviously we're talking about 3rd, 4th century
Yeah, he
AD.
died in 427 A.D.
So they didn't have mics then, but essentially that's what he did.
Scroll drop. It would have been less dramatic,
Yeah.
but you could still have pulled it off because it's a similar shape.
But he just kind of left the bureaucracy and went to live in a fairly rural area. His whole poetic career is about giving a reason for that. I mean, he's trying to enunciate a kind of aesthetic and an ideology about why it's okay to just say, you know what, I'm going to turn my back on the accepted, the way that, if I could put it in beat terms, the way that the man thinks I should do.
I don't think those are beat terms, but
Whatever.
Yeah.
That's certainly a term a person of the beat movement would use.
I don't know. But, it's interesting, because the beat poets are very urban poets. This is why I find it odd.
Fair enough.
The whole thing with Tao Yuanming is not that. And we should point out here, because I think a lot of people aren't aware of this, but China had massive urban areas, even at this point in time. We're
Considerably larger than most other places outside of
in Europe.
Yeah, so no, Rome was bigger.
Well, that may be true. Yeah, you're well, at this point, no.
So we're talking about the 3rd, 4th century A.D. Rome was still
Actually,
bigger.
that's true.
I
No,
believe.
you're right. It would have been in the decline, but it still would have been a very large city.
Chang'an, the capital, which is today modern Xi'an, would have been probably comparable with Rome.
Yeah. In any case, there is already a long-established bureaucracy, urban areas, so much so that someone like Tao Yuanming, who's turning his back on them, actually seems like a rebel. I mean, this is not a largely agrarian society where becoming a farmer or something is normal.
We should also point out, so this is, we've said it several times, the 3rd, 4th century A.D. That's the Jin Dynasty, which is interesting because it's this period after the Han Dynasty. The Han Dynasty is this kind of
where the dynasty sort of crystallizes what it means to be quote unquote Chinese.
Even today in modern China, the ethnicity that we would call Chinese is actually referred to as
the Han.
The Han.
If you have one of the Chinese terms for Chinese is Hanyu, with the
right.
Han language.
We talk about kanji. That just literally means it's the word for Han letter. So in lots of different spheres, the idea of the Han Dynasty is kind of equated with Chineseness, whatever that word means. And he's coming after the Han Dynasty. He's a couple of centuries afterwards. No dynasty has kind of been able to live up to the Han Dynasty yet at this point. And there's a period of disunity, a long period, several hundred years of disunity that he's writing in. I think probably most comparable is to think about Rome a few centuries later. And you've got this period in, let's say, the 7th or 8th century AD of Rome, where you've got people thinking back like, oh, how great it was when everybody was able to kind of live together in this giant city. Rome in the 7th or 8th century was about 50,000 people, compared with 1 million people a few centuries before in the period we're looking at. So there's just been this kind of collapse civilizationally. Tao Yuanming, who was also called Tao Qian, is dealing with that, and I think he's struggling with some of that in his poetry.
Tao Yuanming's official impetus for leaving all of this stuff behind, he was an aide-de-camp in the military, which would have been a pretty good post. And he essentially just got sick and tired of the infighting and the corruption, and especially after his sister died, he just decided to cash out and move on. Now, we should point out, though, this isn't like... The whole back to nature thing isn't, in a sense, kind of contrived, because he was fairly well-to-do.
He was really. He was part of the Tao family. The Tao family was very big in the Jin dynasty, and I think it's my understanding he was kind of a lesser branch.
Yeah, it reminds me, this is kind of maybe a random reference, but if you've ever seen Scorsese's film The Aviator, there's a scene in which this extremely wealthy family is sitting at the table with Howard Hughes, the inventor and weirdo, and they're all talking about the socialist lifestyle and all that. And one of them says, we just don't care for money here. And the Howard Hughes character says, yeah, that's because you've always had it. And it is kind of a contrived thing, because this is Tao Yuanming choosing to go back to back to nature.
And he pretends in this poem, which we should go ahead and turn to.
Should.
The name of the poem that we're looking at is actually a series of poems. So it's 归园天住, so returning to the gardens and fields to live.
Yeah.
And we're looking at the first one of this series of poems.
And we are, I should also point out, we are using a translation by the extremely accomplished scholar and translator Arthur Waley. Not perhaps the best translation of this poem, but it is, I think, the easiest to find, so that's one of the reasons we're using it. I'll just go ahead and read it, because it's not super long. When I was young, I was out of tune with the herd. My only love was for the hills and mountains. Unwitting, I fell into the web of the world's dust and was not free until my 30th year. The migrant bird longs for the old wood. The fish in the tank thinks of its native pool. I had rescued from wildness a patch of the southern moor, and, still rustic, I returned to field and garden. My ground covers no more than 10 acres. My thatched cottage has 8 or 9 rooms. Elms and willows cluster by the eaves. Peach trees and plum trees grow before the hall. Hazy the distant hamlets of men. Steady the smoke of the half-deserted village. A dog barks somewhere in the deep lanes. A cock crows at the top of the mulberry tree. At gate and courtyard, no murmur of the world's dust. In the empty rooms, leisure and deep stillness. Long I lived, checked by the bars of a cage. Now I have turned again to nature and freedom.
Wow.
Yeah, I know. It really is. I think you get a sense of this in English, but it really is magnificent in Chinese. For my money, it really brings out a lot of what makes poetic language in Chinese so, frankly, just bewitching. It's concise. It does with just tiny bits of information what you would need lots of words. And on the page, in fact, here you see that, lots of words to pull off.
You pointed out before that he's kind of responding to the earlier poetry, which is incredibly ornate. This is not at all ornate. It's very, I don't mean simple in a bad way, but simple in a very good way. The kind of George Orwell and Politics and the English Language, where you want language to be, you want to cut language
Yeah.
as close to the bone as possible while leaving just enough meat on it
Yeah.
to do its thing. This is an incredibly beautiful poem.
Well, it's like there's an extant story about Ezra Pound when he was talking to, I think, T.S. Eliot's uncle or someone like that, and the uncle asks him, "So what are you writing about?" And Ezra Pound gives this long, involved explanation, and the uncle says, "What does that mean?" And Ezra Pound just gives him the one-sentence breakdown. And the uncle says, "Why didn't you just say that then?" And that really floored him because Pound was like, "Yeah, why don't I just say that?" And this is similar. Yeah, we could write a long story about this, but why not just give you simply the details? And one of the things we should point out here with this style especially is that there are not a lot of qualifying or descriptive adjectives. We have, for example, peach trees and plum trees grow before the hall. Not tall plum trees. They're not compared to anything before or after. They're just peach trees. So if you can see in your mind peach trees, you've got it. But that's it. He doesn't give you anything else. It's very spare. There's very little description.
Yeah, I mean, it's using these kind of images to evoke something larger. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't need adjectives because the nouns,
Right.
the things that he talks about, represent something much, much greater.
Yeah. Much greater, and yet this is also one of the kind of paradoxes of this kind of writing. You can just read this whole thing as a simple. It's just a simple thing. This person who's just gotten sick of all the corruption in society just is happy to have his plum trees and his peach trees. Although you will notice the line, "My thatched cottage has 8 or 9 rooms." Place with 8 rooms? Are you kidding? I think that's hilarious. That line, you have the lines before then are like this one. "And still rustic, I returned to field and garden." Still rustic. So he's still rustic with his 8 or 9 rooms, right? But yet, we have to bear in mind, too, that even with the pretense that he's heading back to nature, he's still an educated gentleman, and that's what you have to appreciate.
You asked me before what I hated about Thoreau, and I think one of the things that I hated about him was the pretense
Right.
that he was heading back to nature, because Walden is a mile from town. And I think there's something of that in this poem, but I don't feel like I hate Tao Yuanming as much. I don't know why.
Maybe because he's Chinese. Maybe there's distance or something.
I actually think it goes back to the simpleness of his language, whereas I think Thoreau tends to be very verbose.
That's true.
Tao Yuanming is so spare and so cutting linguistically in his poetry.
And Walden does seem kind of self-important.
Yeah.
Like, read these 100 pages of me, living in a cabin when I don't actually have to. Whereas these poems by Tao Yuanming are very simple and spare, and you get the idea that he doesn't actually care if you read them or not, which of course is the advantage of having enough money to have 8 or 9 rooms in a cottage.
He is writing stuff down, and so he clearly wants us to read it, even if he's like positioning himself as if I'm too cool to care if
Right.
you read me or not.
Which is sort of the pretense you have to deal with whenever you read stuff like this is, "Oh, I don't actually care if you read this, but I'm still going to publish it." So, but it's interesting to me, though, that this is a 5th century writer. He dies in 423 AD, and which means this is a really long-running ideal, this sort of heading back to nature and living the simple life. It's like it's a necessary thing that occurs in every major city or advanced civilization. People always want to get away from it. So the other thing about this poem that's interesting is that Tao Yuanming presents it as a return, right? He starts off by talking about when he was young. He was Whaley's translation is "out of tune with the herd." Kind of peculiar, but I think you get the idea. It's sort of like a bunch of animals clustering together for no reason. He says, "My only love was for the hills and mountains." Scholars think that he comes from an area of great natural beauty in China, in the countryside, like most people would have been born. So the whole thing is not a discovery, it's a return. And I think that's interesting because there's a lot of other writing, other traditions of people who come from a small place, a simple place, and go to sort of the center of civilization, right? This is where you're going to make it big, and you get there and realize you're miserable and you hate it. And at least in Tao Yuanming's poetry, the idea is once he went back, that's when he was truly happy. It's when he realized, okay, this is who I really am. And you can see how this survives in Chinese culture over the years, because up until, I think it was just a couple of years ago that the majority of Chinese people was in the countryside. It's now shifted. But even then, there's this notion all throughout Chinese history that the vast majority of the population is not in the city. What's out there? What are we missing? And Tao Yuanming is a poet, it's kind of the poet of that idea that, yeah, we are missing something. Let's go back. Let's go back to it. That's funny. As I talk about this, all I can think of is a lot of contemporary, what scans as country music. You know what I'm talking about? Anyway, you go in, there's this country music playing. You think to yourself, how does this doesn't sound like the country. Right. But, people from the country are pretty stoked that you have really cool music. Basically, the country life sounds cool. And Tao Yuanming makes the country life sound cool, right? Like educated, literate, cultured, not something that it's not rustic and backward and boring. It's a place of discovery and sort of romance, something I think actually Mao Zedong probably would have greatly appreciated.
Yeah, so I just want to point something out really quickly before we go. There's an interesting study, I think probably the best study in the last few years on Tao Yuanming, that is called The Records of a Dusty Table, Tao Yuanming and Manuscript Culture. It's by Tian Xiaofei at Harvard. She points out that there's this interesting thing where the Tao Yuanming that we get is incredibly different, probably, from the Tao Yuanming who was actually written, because it's like constantly mediated through all of these different copyists. And so we have to be very careful. Like the Tao Yuanming that we're reading, that Tao Yuanming of the country music superstar, we'll say.
The Toby Keith of the Fifth Dynasty.
Of the fourth, the Toby Keith of ancient Chinese culture might not be the real Tao Yuanming. I mean, to bring
he
another...
might be Willie Nelson. I don't know.
To bring another music reference, if we could.
Please.
One of the things Tian Xiaofei asked is, would the real Tao Yuanming please stand up?
Wow, we've now... I want to just point this out. We've now combined Toby Keith and Eminem in one reference to a single writer. Very hard to do, but that's why we're professionals.
There is this question, like when we look at not just Tao Yuanming, but all of Chinese literature, who are we reading? I mean, we're not reading the stuff that they wrote, that they physically put down on a paper. It's all mediated through all of these different layers.
And certainly there's a desire to preserve the glorious, romantic Tao Yuanming and not something else. I mean, that's obvious. If you're going to market somebody, that's a really marketable idea, especially now with Chinese cities growing as they are. This idea of a return to nature from the 5th century, it's part of history even, is an awfully appealing idea.
Yeah. And so I guess the question is this guy who returns to the fields and gardens to live, as he says in this poem, is it even the real Tao Yuanming? Well,
I mean, it takes us back to sort of classic nerd questions with literature is, to what extent is anything you read ever, what it appears to be. But I think for the purposes of just this podcast, it is, regardless of how it's been transmitted, regardless of whether it's the real Tao Yuanming, it's a really beautiful poem. Tao Yuanming had immense influence on the poets who followed him for this very spare, very concise style. And I think anyone who's interested in Chinese poetry at all really needs to read Tao Yuanming to see how the style develops over the years and how he shapes what comes after him.
I think that's a good place to end it, Rob.
It usually is with my brilliant summations.
We'll try and add our own translation of this Tao Yuanming poem.
Oh, Lord, I don't know if anyone deserves that horror. Arthur Whaley's, I think, probably accomplished enough.
All right. Well, I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.